On a crisp evening in Santa Monica, California, a quaint cafe sat nestled along the pier. Its entrance bore a small decorative plaque that read, "True beauty captivates, but it is the soul that enchants. Desire begins at the surface, but love blooms in the character that transcends appearances." The phrase was etched in elegant cursive, hinting at the stories that often unfolded within its walls. For Jefferson Scott Harlan, a 35-year-old entrepreneur from New York City, this evening was supposed to be just another step in his attempt to escape the monotony of his high-stakes business life. The endless cycle of boardroom meetings, financial victories, and social engagements had dulled his once vivid spark for life. He had arrived in Los Angeles a week ago, seeking a brief respite from his rigorous routine. Jefferson chose Santa Monica for its charm, neither too bustling nor too quiet. It offered just the right dose of vibrancy he needed. That night, the warm glow of the cafe drew him in. He stepped inside, his tailored blazer contrasting with the laid-back ambiance of the place. Among the patrons sat a woman who immediately caught his attention. She had golden blonde hair that shimmered in the light and an aura of understated elegance that made her stand out in the cozy cafe. Her name was Madison Rose Caldwell, though Jefferson wouldn't learn that until later. Feeling an inexplicable pull, Jefferson approached her table with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking bold risks. "Excuse me," he began, his deep voice carrying a blend of curiosity and warmth. "Would you mind if I joined you? The place seems to be packed tonight." Madison looked up, her piercing blue eyes meeting his. For a brief moment she hesitated, studying the man who had interrupted her quiet evening. Finally, she offered a small smile and gestured to the seat across from her. "Sure, I could use some company." What followed was a conversation that neither of them expected. Jefferson spoke candidly about his life, his success in the corporate world, his ventures across the globe, and the sense of emptiness that had begun to creep into his seemingly perfect existence. Madison listened intently, occasionally offering insights about her own life as a freelance artist and her love for the unpredictability of California. As the hours passed, Jefferson found himself captivated not just by Madison's striking beauty, but by her spirit. She was sharp, compassionate, and refreshingly genuine. "You know," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I've only just met you, but there's something about you that feels grounding, like a piece of the world I didn't realize I was missing." Madison chuckled softly, a tinge of color rising in her cheeks. "You don't even know me," she replied, though her tone lacked skepticism. "That's true," Jefferson admitted, his expression turning earnest, "but I don't need years to recognize when something or someone extraordinary crosses my path." The words hung between them, charged with an intensity neither of them could ignore. Before Madison could respond, Jefferson, emboldened by the moment, made a decision that surprised even himself. "Madison," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions within him, "I know this might sound crazy, but would you marry me tonight?" Madison stared at him, her expression a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. The hum of conversation around them faded as her mind raced to process the audacious proposal. "Marry you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Jefferson affirmed, his gaze unwavering. "Here, now in this magical corner of Santa Monica, I've spent too much time chasing what doesn't matter. And now that I've found you, I don't want to waste another second." Madison's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to reconcile the surreal nature of the situation. She had always prided herself on being rational, but something about Jefferson's raw sincerity tugged at her in a way she couldn't explain. She took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to the glowing lights of the pier, visible through the cafe windows. It was a place where dreams felt possible, where the ordinary often gave way to the extraordinary, and tonight she decided to embrace it. "Yes," she said softly, a smile breaking across her face. "I'll marry you." The hours that followed were a whirlwind. Jefferson and Madison made their way to a nearby wedding chapel, a charming little place adorned with twinkling fairy lights. The officiant, a kind older man, performed the ceremony with warmth and grace, sealing their vows in a matter of minutes. As they stepped out of the chapel hand in hand, Madison couldn't help but laugh at the sheer spontaneity of it all. Jefferson squeezed her hand gently, his smile mirroring her joy. "I can't believe we just did that," Madison said, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. "Neither can I," Jefferson admitted, "but it feels right, doesn't it?" Madison nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. Jefferson led her to a sleek black sports car he had rented for his trip, a vehicle that seemed almost too extravagant for their impromptu adventure. With the top down and the cool night air brushing against their faces, they sped down the Pacific Coast Highway, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Laughter and conversation filled the car as they reveled in the unexpected turn their lives had taken. But just as everything seemed perfect, fate intervened in the most devastating way. At an intersection near the city limits, another car barreled toward them, its driver visibly intoxicated. Madison saw the approaching headlights first, her breath catching in her throat. "Jefferson, watch out!" she screamed, her voice laced with panic. Jefferson reacted instantly, swerving the car to shield Madison from the impact. The crash was violent, the sound of metal crumpling and glass shattering, reverberating through the air. When the car finally came to a stop, Madison was shaken but relatively unharmed, save for a few scratches. She turned to Jefferson, her chest tightening at the sight of him slumped against the seat. Blood streaked his face and his breathing was shallow. "Jefferson," she choked out, her hands trembling as she tried to rouse him. "Stay with me, please." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as first responders arrived at the scene. Paramedics worked quickly, extricating Jefferson from the wreckage and stabilizing him as best they could. Madison rode in the ambulance, her mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. She held Jefferson's hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement, even as tears streamed down her face. At the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses rushed Jefferson into the trauma unit. Madison was left in the waiting area, her heart pounding as she grappled with the possibility of losing the man she had just vowed to spend her life with. Hours passed before a doctor approached her, his expression grave. "Ms. Caldwell," he began, his tone gentle but firm. "Jefferson is in critical condition. He sustained a severe head injury and multiple fractures. We've placed him in a medically induced coma to stabilize him, but there's a risk of permanent brain damage." Madison felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The doctor's words blurred together as a crushing wave of despair threatened to consume her. Madison sat motionless in the hospital waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "There's a risk of permanent brain damage." She tried to imagine what that might mean, Jefferson unable to move, speak, or remember who he was, let alone who she was. The man she had just promised to share her life with now faced an uncertain future, and she couldn't stop the torrent of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Hours turned into days, and Madison remained at Jefferson's side as much as the hospital staff would allow. His body, battered and frail, was kept alive by machines and the unwavering vigilance of the medical team. But as the days wore on, Madison found her initial resolve beginning to crack. Late one evening, as Jefferson lay unconscious, Madison found herself alone in his room. The steady rhythm of the machines filled the silence. She leaned over him, her fingers brushing against his cold hand. "I'm so sorry, Jefferson," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "This isn't what I expected. This isn't the life I imagined for us." Her words hung heavy in the air, laced with guilt and an undertone of selfishness she couldn't deny. Madison had always been a dreamer, envisioning a future filled with adventure and passion. But now, staring at the stark reality of Jefferson's condition, she couldn't ignore the gnawing fear
that her life might become defined by his limitations. As she wrestled with her thoughts, Madison didn't notice the soft creak of the door opening behind her. Standing just inside the room was a nurse. Her name tag read April White. She was young, with kind eyes and a quiet presence that seemed to fill the space without intruding. April hesitated, her instinct telling her not to interrupt. But as Madison turned and their eyes met, the nurse stepped forward. "Mrs. Caldwell," April said gently, her voice barely above a whisper, "I just wanted to check on Mr. Harlan's vitals." Madison nodded, stepping aside to let April tend to Jefferson. The nurse moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting the machines and noting his condition. Yet, as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The way Madison had spoken earlier, the undercurrent of hesitation in her tone, it struck a chord in April, who had spent years caring for patients and witnessing the raw, unfiltered emotions of their loved ones. When she finished her tasks, April turned to Madison, offering a small, compassionate smile. "He's stable for now," she said. "That's a good sign." Madison forced a weak smile in return. "Thank you," she replied, her voice trembling. April hesitated again, sensing the inner turmoil in Madison's eyes. "If you need someone to talk to," she offered, "I'm here. Sometimes it helps to share what you're feeling, even if it's just with a stranger." Madison looked at her, startled by the unexpected kindness. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. Instead, she simply nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of her unspoken doubts. Over the following days, April became a constant presence in Jefferson's care. She treated him with a tenderness that went beyond her professional duties, speaking to him softly and making small adjustments to ensure his comfort. Each time she entered the room, Madison felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because Jefferson was in good hands, but unease because April's quiet devotion served as a mirror, reflecting Madison's own faltering commitment. One evening, Madison arrived at the hospital after stepping out for a brief respite. As she approached Jefferson's room, she paused just outside the door, hearing a voice from within. "Jefferson," April was saying, her tone warm and earnest, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I believe in you. You're stronger than this, and I know you'll come back to us." To her. Madison's breath caught in her throat. She peeked through the partially open door and saw April sitting beside Jefferson's bed, holding his hand gently between her own. There was a quiet intimacy in the moment that stirred something deep within Madison, an uncomfortable mix of gratitude and jealousy. The days stretched on, and Madison's visits to the hospital grew shorter and less frequent. She told herself it was because she needed to take care of practical matters, sorting through Jefferson's finances, communicating with his business partners, but deep down, she knew the truth. The weight of Jefferson's condition, the uncertainty of his future, was more than she could bear. Meanwhile, April's dedication only deepened. She continued to care for Jefferson with unwavering compassion, taking every opportunity to stimulate his senses and encourage even the smallest signs of progress. She played soft music, brought in fresh flowers to brighten the room, and read aloud from books she thought might spark a connection. One night, after a particularly long shift, April sat by Jefferson's bedside, her exhaustion evident, but her spirit undiminished. She reached for his hand, holding it firmly as she spoke. "Jefferson," she said softly, "I don't know why, but I feel like I was meant to be here for you. Maybe it's silly, but I believe you're going to wake up, and when you do, I'll be right here." Unbeknownst to April, Madison had returned to the hospital and stood just outside the room listening to every word. As she heard April's quiet declarations, a pang of guilt shot through her. She had promised to stand by Jefferson's side, yet here was a stranger doing what she could not, showing unwavering loyalty and hope in the face of uncertainty. Madison stood frozen outside the door, her emotions in turmoil as she listened to April's heartfelt words. A part of her wanted to barge in, to reassert her role as Jefferson's wife. But another part,
the one she didn't want to acknowledge, felt relieved that someone else was carrying the burden she had begun to abandon. As days turned into weeks, Madison's visits became sporadic. When she did come, her demeanor was cold, her interactions with Jefferson brief and perfunctory. She spent more time outside his room, talking to doctors and reviewing paperwork, than sitting by his side. One quiet afternoon, April returned to Jefferson's room after stepping out for a short break. She found Madison standing by his bedside, her expression hard to read. For a moment, April thought perhaps Madison had had a change of heart, that she was finally ready to fully support her husband. But as she approached, she overheard Madison murmuring words that sent a chill down her spine. "I'm sorry, Jefferson," Madison said, her tone devoid of genuine remorse. "This isn't the life I signed up for. I didn't marry you to become a nurse or a caretaker. I deserve more than this." April froze just outside the doorway, her heart pounding. She wanted to intervene, to defend Jefferson even if he couldn't defend himself. But she stayed silent, unsure of how to confront Madison without escalating the situation. Madison continued, oblivious to April's presence. "I'll talk to the doctors," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's not right to keep you like this. Maybe it's time to let you go." April's breath caught in her throat. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped into the room, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and determination. "Mrs. Caldwell," April said firmly, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside her. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you suggesting that Jefferson be taken off life support?" Madison turned, startled by April's sudden appearance. Her initial shock quickly gave way to indignation. "This is none of your business," she snapped. "I'm his wife. It's my decision." April met her gaze without flinching. "I understand that you're his wife, but I also know what I've seen and heard. Jefferson deserves a chance to recover, and from what I can tell, you're not making decisions based on his best interests." Madison's eyes narrowed, her tone turning icy. "How dare you question my motives? You're just a nurse. You don't know what it's like to face this kind of responsibility." "You're right," April replied calmly. "I'm not his wife, but I care about him, and I believe he has a fighting chance, even if you've already given up on him." The tension between the two women was palpable. Madison looked as though she wanted to lash out, but instead she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, muttering something under her breath. April let out a shaky sigh, her hands trembling as she approached Jefferson's bedside. She gently adjusted his blankets, her heart aching for the man who lay so vulnerable before her. "Jefferson," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I won't let her do this to you." I promise. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Madison began pressing the doctors to consider discontinuing Jefferson's life support, citing the strain it was putting on both of them. But April, fueled by her growing connection to Jefferson and her conviction that he deserved a chance, refused to back down. She spoke to the medical team, sharing her observations and advocating for more time. The turning point came one night when April was alone with Jefferson. As she held his hand, speaking to him in the soothing tone she had come to use during their one-sided conversations, she felt a faint movement. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then it happened again. A weak but deliberate squeeze of her hand. "Jefferson?" she gasped, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" A faint groan escaped his lips, followed by the slightest flicker of his eyelids. April's heart leapt as she realized what was happening. She rushed to alert the doctors, who quickly confirmed that Jefferson was beginning to show signs of emerging from his coma. It was a delicate process, and his condition remained critical, but the progress was undeniable. When Madison learned of Jefferson's improvement, her reaction was a mixture of shock and dread. She knew that if Jefferson fully regained consciousness, her true intentions might come to light. She tried to feign excitement, but her anxiety was evident to those around her. Meanwhile, April remained by Jefferson's side, her hope renewed. She continued to encourage him, her voice and touch serving as a lifeline as he slowly began to recover. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Jefferson finally opened his eyes fully. His gaze wandered around the room before settling on April. He tried to speak, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "April," he murmured, his lips forming the name with effort. April's eyes filled with tears as she leaned closer, her hand clasping his tightly. "I'm here, Jefferson," she said softly. "I'm here." Jefferson's recovery was far from complete, but in that moment April knew that he had crossed a critical threshold. And as Madison watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable, she began to realize that the fragile facade she had constructed was beginning to crumble. Jefferson's fragile voice and the clarity with which he had called for April became the catalyst for a dramatic shift in the hospital room. Madison, standing in the doorway, felt the sting of rejection and the weight of her own miscalculations. Her once controlled demeanor faltered as she watched April take her place at Jefferson's side, with a tenderness Madison couldn't summon, even when it mattered most. The medical team quickly surrounded Jefferson, assessing his condition and carefully noting the signs of improvement. Although his voice was faint and his movements were limited, his ability to respond was nothing short of miraculous given the severity of his injuries. Madison, realizing that her position as Jefferson's wife was becoming increasingly tenuous, stepped forward and forced a strained smile. "Jefferson," she said, her voice laced with forced sweetness, "I can't believe you're awake. I've been so worried about you." Jefferson turned his head slowly in her direction, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, and Madison felt her carefully constructed facade begin to crack under the weight of his gaze. "Madison," Jefferson finally rasped, his voice low and deliberate, "why are you here?" The question hit Madison like a physical blow. She stammered, struggling to come up with a response. "I'm your wife," she said, her voice quivering. "Where else would I be?" Jefferson's eyes flickered with a mixture of weariness and clarity. "I remember," he said softly, pausing to catch his breath. "I remember what you said when you thought I couldn't hear you." The room fell silent, the gravity of Jefferson's words sinking in. Madison's face paled, and her carefully constructed mask of concern shattered. "Jefferson, you don't understand," she began, her voice rising in desperation. "I was just overwhelmed. I didn't mean—" "You said you'd—" "Let me go," Jefferson interrupted, his words slow but cutting. "For my money." April, standing beside Jefferson, felt a surge of protectiveness and resolve. She didn't speak, allowing Jefferson the space to confront Madison in his own way. Madison's expression twisted into a mixture of panic and defiance. "You can't hold that against me," she snapped, her voice sharp now. "You were unconscious. How could you possibly know what I said?" Jefferson closed his eyes briefly, his strength waning. "It doesn't matter how I know," he replied, his tone steady despite his exhaustion. "What matters is that I do." The door opened and two police officers stepped into the room, summoned discreetly by one of the doctors who had grown suspicious of Madison's motives after speaking with April. Madison's eyes widened as they approached her. "Madison Rose Caldwell," one of the officers said, his voice firm but calm, "we have reason to believe you've been attempting to influence medical decisions for financial gain. We'll need you to come with us for questioning." "What?" Madison exclaimed, her voice rising in disbelief. "This is ridiculous. I'm his wife." "And as his wife, you should have his best interests at heart," April said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "But you don't, Madison. Jefferson deserves better." Madison turned toward April, her expression a mixture of fury and humiliation. "You think you're so noble," she hissed, "but you don't know what it's like to stand in my shoes." "I don't need to," April replied calmly. "I just know what it means to care for someone without expecting anything in return." Madison glared at April one last time before the officers escorted her from the room. The door closed behind them, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. April turned back to Jefferson, her hand still resting gently on his. His eyes met hers, and though his exhaustion was evident, there was a flicker of gratitude in his gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. April shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't have to thank me, Jefferson," she said softly. "I'm just glad you're still here." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and medical milestones. Madison's actions were scrutinized, and as evidence of her intentions came to light, Jefferson's legal team moved to annul their brief and fraudulent marriage. Meanwhile, Jefferson's recovery progressed slowly but steadily, with April by his side every step of the way. One afternoon, as Jefferson sat propped up in his hospital bed, his strength slowly returning, he turned to April with a thoughtful expression. "April," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about how close I came to losing everything, including myself." April nodded, her hand resting on his arm. "You've been through so much, Jefferson, but you're here, and that's what matters." Jefferson reached for her hand, his grip still weak but filled with intention. "I wouldn't be here without you," he said earnestly. "You didn't just take care of me, you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." April smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "You don't have to say that, Jefferson. I was just doing my job." "No," Jefferson said firmly, shaking his head. "What you did went far beyond any job. You saved me, April, and I'll never forget it." Their eyes met, and in that moment a deep and undeniable connection passed between them, a bond forged in adversity and strengthened by hope. As Jefferson's recovery progressed, his gratitude toward April deepened into something neither of them had anticipated. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations grew more personal, revealing shared dreams and vulnerabilities. April remained unwavering in her commitment, but her feelings for Jefferson became more complex with each passing day. One sunny morning, Jefferson sat in a wheelchair by the hospital's large window overlooking a small garden. April had brought him there after their routine physical therapy session, eager to give him a change of scenery. "It's beautiful out there," Jefferson remarked, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "I almost forgot what sunlight feels like." "It's a sign of progress," April said with a warm smile. "You're getting stronger every day, Jefferson. Soon enough, you'll be out there enjoying it firsthand." Jefferson glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "You always say that, about progress, about moving forward. But I wonder, have I really changed, or am I just lucky to have survived?" April knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his. "You're not just lucky, Jefferson. You fought for this. Every step you've taken, every milestone you've reached, it's all because of your resilience." He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small smile, he said, "I don't think I would have made it without you, April." "You would have," April replied, though her voice faltered slightly. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Jefferson shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "No, April, you're the one who's strong. Strong enough to stand by someone like me even when things looked hopeless." April felt her cheeks flush, but before she could respond, Jefferson reached out and gently took her hand. "You stayed by my side when no one else did," he continued. "You gave me hope when I didn't have any. And now, I find myself hoping for something else." April's heart skipped a beat. She searched his face, uncertain of what he meant but overwhelmed by the intensity of his gaze. "April," Jefferson said softly, his voice filled with sincerity, "I don't know where my life is going from here. Everything I thought I understood about the world has changed. But one thing I'm sure of is this. I want you to be a part of it." April's breath caught in her throat. She had always prided herself on maintaining professional boundaries, but her connection to Jefferson had grown into something far more profound than either of them had expected. "Jefferson," she began, her voice trembling, I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll stay," he said simply, "not as my nurse, but as the person who showed me that love can mean something deeper than appearances or convenience." Tears welled in April's eyes as she struggled to find the right words. "I've always believed in you, Jefferson," she said finally, "and I'd be honored to be part of your life wherever it takes us." Their connection deepened over the weeks that followed as Jefferson continued his journey of recovery. The annulment of his marriage to Madison was finalized, and she faded from his life as quietly as she had entered it, leaving behind only the lessons he had learned from her betrayal. One afternoon, as Jefferson took his first tentative steps with the help of a walker, he turned to April, his face glowing with determination. "April," he said, his voice steady, "I have something I want to ask you." She smiled, standing close to support him if he faltered. "What is it?" He straightened as much as his recovering body would allow, meeting her gaze with unwavering certainty. "Will you marry me?" April's heart swelled with emotion. She had watched Jefferson transform from a man battered by circumstances to someone stronger, wiser, and deeply committed to living a life of authenticity. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy, "I will." Their wedding was a simple but beautiful ceremony held in the hospital's garden, surrounded by the people who had supported Jefferson throughout his recovery. As they exchanged vows, Jefferson reached for April's hands, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "You taught me what real love looks like," he said. "It's not about perfection or appearances. It's about showing up for each other, no matter what." April smiled through her tears, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. "And you taught me that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope." As they kissed, sealing their vows, the garden seemed to glow with the promise of a new beginning. Jefferson and April's love story had been born from adversity, but it was one they knew would endure, proof that the deepest connections are forged not in moments of ease, but in the trials that reveal the beauty of the soul. Jefferson and April's life together blossomed into a testament of resilience, love, and the transformative power of human connection. After leaving the hospital, Jefferson embraced his second chance with a renewed sense of purpose. He sold his stake in the cutthroat corporate world that had once defined him, choosing instead to dedicate his time and resources to building a foundation for people recovering from traumatic injuries, much like he had. April, who had always approached her work with compassion, joined Jefferson in his mission. Together they created programs that combined medical care with emotional support, ensuring that no patient or family ever felt abandoned in their darkest moments. The couple settled in a small, sunlit home near the California coastline, where the scent of the ocean always reminded them of the fresh start they had found together. Life wasn't without its challenges. Jefferson's recovery remained a work in progress, and the memories of betrayal and hardship lingered at the edges of their happiness. But with each passing day, they chose to focus on the love and purpose they had discovered in one another. Years later, Jefferson stood with April at the opening of their nonprofit's flagship center. The plaque at the entrance bore a phrase that had once hung on the wall of a quiet cafe, etched now as a reminder of the journey that had brought them here. "True beauty captivates, but it is the soul that enchants. Desire begins at the surface, but love blooms in the character that transcends appearances." April looked up at Jefferson, her hand resting on his arm. "It's perfect," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "It's us," Jefferson replied, his gaze warm and unwavering. Their story, born from adversity, had become a beacon of hope for others, a reminder that even in life's most difficult moments, love has the power to heal, rebuild, and endure. And as they walked hand in hand into the building that symbolized their shared mission, Jefferson and April knew they had created a legacy far greater than either of them could have imagined, a legacy rooted in the beauty of the soul.